Hi, my name is Katie Gilliam, and I'll be talking about Aristotle's virtue theory. So, Aristotle talks about Nicomachean ethics, and he defines virtue as when all humans must rationally express and define human good by performing virtuous actions and constantly strive to improve upon their own personal virtuosity. According to Aristotle, to be virtuous is to live a good life. And to him, a good life is a life that is filled with virtuous actions. An action is virtuous if a virtuous person acting in character, which means without any hidden motives or conscious intent, would perform that action considering the current circumstances of the situation at hand. So, how do we define vices and virtues? So there are three components to the feelings of the soul. The first component are passions, and they are the emotions that we feel, such as anger or joy. We cannot use passions to define vices and virtues because we cannot blame our emotions themselves or judge our emotions to be inherently bad because we all have the same range of emotions. The second component to the feelings of the soul are faculties. Faculties involve the human ability to feel passion or emotions. Again, we cannot use faculties to define vices and virtues because our ability to feel emotions is an objective standard for all human beings and therefore cannot determine whether a person is acting in accordance with a vice or a virtue. The third component to the feelings of the soul are states of character, and by process of elimination, we can assume that we use states of character to define what vices and virtues are. So states of character involve how we act in accordance to our passions and faculties, and how we choose to behave based on the emotions that we feel. So, to Aristotle and his theory of virtue, vices and virtues of a single characteristic exist on the spectrum. There is an excess vice, which occurs when an individual acts in excess of a virtue, and there is a defect vice, which an individual expresses too little of a virtue. To act virtuously is to act in the intermediate mean between the defect vice and the excess vice. So, again, as vices and virtues, a single characteristic exists on the spectrum. Each individual's placement on the spectrum is dependent on their own choices, and every individual decides for themselves whether they will act moderately and rationally, or if they will fall victim to an excess or a deficiency of a vice. So, again, for Aristotle's theory of virtue, one must always react and behave in a way that can be deemed necessary or appropriate for the situation at hand. Virtues can be considered to be an intermediate mean between an excess vice and defect vice. So, to reiterate, an excess vice can be achieved by giving into too much of a virtue or by acting excessively past what is necessary or appropriate for the circumstances at hand, while a defect vice would occur when an individual abstains too much from a virtue, or a person acts too weakly or is too unresponsive compared to what is appropriate for those circumstances. So an example of a virtue using Aristotle's scale of an intermediate mean, excess vice, and defect vice would be compassion. So a defect vice would be when a person has a lack of compassion and has apathetic feelings, as this may damage individuals' relationships, as it seems like the other person doesn't care too much about other people. The virtue would be when the individual is compassionate when compassion is due, and the individual can make the difference in between compassion. And the excess vice would be when a person is too compassionate and the individual's niceties will be taken advantage of, and the individual may put compassion towards others to the point that they disregard their own personal mental health and well-being. Another example of a virtue would be happiness. So the defect vice would be a lack of happiness or excessive sadness. And depression infringes on happiness, which Aristotle believes to be a virtuous action, as you cannot live a good and virtuous life if you're sad. The virtue would be that the individual can switch between being happy and sad depending on what the situation calls for. And the excess vice would be that the person is constantly happy and or unrealistically optimistic. And this may cause there to be an ability to take some situations seriously, and it may come across as empathetic, as it is not always good to be happy in all scenarios. For example, if it is not socially acceptable, at least in the United States, to be constantly happy when going to a funeral, at least in the United States. So to act virtuously regarding happiness would to be able to switch between being happy, being moderately happy, or moderately or sad, depending on what the situation and circumstances at hand calls for. So how do we become virtuous? So according to Aristotle, we can become virtuous through habituation. So in order to become virtuous, we must mimic like activities from others that we deem to be virtuous from an early age, which is most often our parents or other figures. And over time, we will be able to develop our own sense of virtuosity and determine what virtues we have chosen to solidify and implement into our own personal identity and character. For example, we do not know what it is to be kind or to be angry or to be generous when we were born. We must depend on our natural ability as humans to rationalize and discriminate between what constitutes a good or virtuous action on our own in order to know how to behave. In other words, virtue has to be learned. If we want to become honest and virtuous people, we must first perform honest actions continually and on a consistent basis in order to truly become virtuous. And again, just to summarize, whether a person shows characteristics of a vice or virtue, for a single variable is not static, and people have the ability to change their behavior to be more virtuous due to that ability that we have as humans to rationalize and make decisions based on that rationality. For example, when describing a prodigality, Aristotle defines intermediate mean, excess vice, and defect vice in terms of how a person spends and takes money. The nature of prodigality functions as the excess vice in this scenario, as it describes an extravagant and often wasteful method in which a person can distribute or handle money without taking in enough money to warrant this expenditure. On the other hand, being frugal to the point of stinginess is the defect vice, as spending too little while taking in a lot of money or having a high income can also reflect badly upon one's character. A person who adheres to either of these two vices can learn to adhere to the intermediate mean of liberality, meaning that he spends an appropriate amount of money relative to his income, and therefore can learn to become a virtuous person over time. Just as a person can initially learn to act in alignment with the vice through habituation, a person can choose to change their behavior and rationally determine how to behave in accordance with the virtue instead. In essence, whether a person shows characteristics of a vice or a virtue is again not static. People who adhere to a vice can, with effort and dedication, become a more virtuous person, and a person who has been virtuous can easily slip into adhering to a vice. Thank you.